It's time to get the story behind the story. Interviews with newsmakers, news breakers, and Vermonters making a difference. WCAX presents 802 News with Mark Johnson. Here's Mark.
Do tariffs raise a lot of money? Do they protect certain American businesses? What is their impact on consumers? In this edition of 802 News, sponsored by Red Hen Baking Company, we get a primer on the history of tariffs and their purpose. Does it make sense for the Trump administration to impose tariffs on foes like China or friends like Canada? We'll begin our discussion with University of Vermont economics professor Rich Sicotte right after this. At Red Hen Baking Company, they believe pure, uncomplicated ingredients in the hands of skilled artisans are the building blocks for great food. They're dedicated to creating the best food from the best ingredients. You'll find an ever-changing lineup of delicious pastries, sandwiches, and soups at their beautiful cafe off Route 2 in Middlesex, just off I-89. Their breads are also available in many other locations. Led by owners Randy George and Eliza Kane, Red Hen Baking Company has been on the leading edge of the local food movement since 1999. All right, let's begin with a little bit of a Tariff 101 here, I guess I'd call it. I understand a little bit more about tariffs than I do Bitcoin, but what is the purpose of tariffs?
Well, a tariff is a tax on imports, and the purpose, actually, I wish there was a straight answer to that question, but there isn't, because there's multiple possible justifications, right? One justification is that it would raise revenue, tax revenue. And historically, in the United States, that was a primary purpose of tariffs up through the imposition of the income tax. That tariffs were the primary source of revenue for the federal government. Then the next purpose, one that I think probably most people would be familiar with, is what we call protectionism. So that would be a way to protect domestic industries from import competition. And those, I would say, the two main purposes, they don't always match up, right? Because the tariff that may raise the most revenue isn't necessarily one that may protect any domestic industry for that matter. Historically, for example, for a while we had tariffs on coffee, right? Which Americans have loved for a very long time. But there's really, outside of Hawaii, which was not part of the United States at the time that was in place, was not really any purpose for protectionism. Another large tariff was on sugar. There is domestic sugar production, and so mainly, I'd say, in Louisiana at that time. Now it's Florida, and now there's beet sugar production. So that's one that can generate a lot of revenue because it's a widely consumed product, and even a relatively modest tariff can generate a great deal of revenue, but it may protect only a small portion of the American economy.
You say that tariffs came into place even before the income tax. I'm remembering from my U.S. history courses that was about in the 20s?
1913.
1913.
Yeah.
All right,
Yeah.
A decade, give or take.
Yeah.
So tariffs go back even further than that.
They go back. They're one of the first laws passed after the Constitution was ratified, because that was Alexander Hamilton's main policy for raising revenue. And if you may recall from if you saw the musical, that the goal at that point, the United States, born into having a massive federal debt, which had assumed the debt of the colonies during the independence, Hamilton was committed to paying that off and establishing the full faith and credit of the United States. Where's that revenue going to come from? It came from the tariff. During the Civil War, the tariff revenue was insufficient because the cost of the Civil War was immense. So they did, in fact, impose income tax during that period of time, but they dismissed it after the war and then replaced it permanently in 1913. But you have to keep in mind that and this is one of the things to keep in mind even today, is that the amount of revenue that could be earned by tariffs today is nowhere near, even in the most optimistic scenarios of any realistic economist, right? Saying the upper bound is nowhere near the full budget of the United States government today. Because the United States government prior to 1913 just simply didn't do a lot. It did field a national army, but the army was relatively small except during the Civil War. It built lighthouses and things of that nature. But today we have a social welfare system that is extremely costly, and our military is immense. Plus, there's a lot of other spending, so-called discretionary spending, things like education and other things that cost a lot of money. So there's really no hope of returning to that time period and gathering enough revenue that you would be able to, for example, eliminate the income tax. That's just not on the table.
So before the imposition of the income tax, tariffs could pretty much cover the cost of government?
For the most part. I mean, there were other sources there were other fees and things like that the government imposed. But yeah, and many countries have followed the same formula. We weren't alone in that respect.
Roughly today, how much of the U.S. budget is funded through tariffs?
I would have to go look. I honestly don't know, because I would say it's at most 5% and probably a lot lower than that.
Okay. Wow. Okay.
It's just not that much. And the thing is that why I said the purpose of raising revenue is at cross purposes with a protection, is that if you have a tariff that's very high, you're not going to get any imports, so therefore you're not going to get any revenue. But it'll be very effective at protecting domestic industry because you've eliminated all of the imports. In order for a tariff to raise revenue, you actually can't choke off all the imports. You have to have the tariff low enough in percentage terms that you're still importing, so you're collecting the revenue, right? And that's very important to keep in mind in the current context. I mean, we just lowered the tariff rates on Chinese goods somewhat, but at 165% or whatever that number was,
right?
I mean, over a period of months, that would basically have stopped all imports from China virtually, and that means no revenue collected on that at all.
Right. So there's a sweet spot.
Yeah. In fact, in economic theory, it's a way to calculate that. You can calculate what's called the revenue maximizing tariff, the particular tariff rate that would maximize the government revenue from that tariff. Now, it'll be different on every individual object.
Among all the goods out there that we import, what are the biggest tariffs on?
For the most part, I'd say, you can imagine that certain industries in the United States have been successful at, more successful than others at getting the government to protect them. And, in the United States, I think, sugar has historically been one. And right now you'd say that, because of the affinity the Trump administration has for some of the manufacturing, that my assumption would be, without really looking into it, that probably these goods like steel and aluminum are relatively high right now. But the average tariff rate prior to these tariffs starting was well under 5%. And there's going to be a lot of variation. And there's a lot of goods that have no tariff on them. I'm talking about prior to the current tariff war. But and that had been a process of negotiation to bring our tariffs down with other countries that really began, after the Great Depression.
Why is the Great Depression a demarcation point?
Well, during, if in the study of American trade policy and really global trade policy, or globalization, widely understood, there would be an era of expanding trade that basically ended with World War I. take it from the Napoleonic Wars up to World War I. And then the interwar period from World War I to World War II was a period of contracting trade.
Okay.
So that is, in the United States case, there was the passage of a law that some people might have heard of called the Smoot-Hawley or Hawley-Smoot Tariff in 1930. And at that time,
I would need A, B, C, and D to have been able to have guessed that.
Well,
and you usually guess C, right? Because that's usually what, if you're going to
right.
guess, you guess C.
If you have a kind professor who doesn't sadistically put all D's or A's, I've been known to do that on occasion, not on purpose. But the Hawley-Smoot tariff had average tariff rates that were very, very high, but would turn out to be, in comparison with some of the tariff rates that have been threatened under the Trump administration, even lower than some of those for some industries. And the United States was not the only country to be imposing very high tariffs around that time period, the interwar period. So, what happened was a worldwide contraction of trade and division into trading blocks, so that the United Kingdom and Canada and the various parts of the British Empire at the time were in one block. Nazi Germany had its own trading block as well. And that was seen as a contributing factor to the Great Depression. It wasn't the only factor by any stretch of the imagination, and I think there's probably some debate as to how significant of a factor it was, because there were other really poor policies in place at the time as well. When President Roosevelt was elected in 1932 and took office in 1933, the Congress passed the following year something called the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act. That empowered the executive to negotiate trade agreements with foreign countries that would bring those tariffs down. Not unlike kind of what we're seeing today, only it's under completely different auspices. And the United States did sign several trade agreements before the outbreak of World War II. But what happened, to fast forward a bit, what happened after World War II is, not too far from here in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. It's actually 1944. There was a conference there where the Allies and other free countries at the time designed the post-war economic order. And one of the things that they discussed, besides the monetary system, was a trade system. Now that it turned out that there was they grew out of this in the late 40s, an attempt to create an international trade organization, but that was not ratified by the United States. So in its place, there was something called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or the GATT. And under this multilateral trade agreement, there were rounds of negotiations. There were many rounds that began in the late 40s, that progressed through the 60s and 70s into the 80s. And the last round that occurred resulted in the 1990s in the creation of the World Trade Organization, right? But over the course of all of these rounds, from the late 40s through the 1990s, the participants and signatories of the World Trade Organization gradually brought their tariffs down vis-a-vis one another. Now, there were some goods were some exceptions, like I alluded to. There's going to be some goods out there that the United States just was not going to cut on. And there are some goods in other countries we're not going to cut on. They were very sensitive to their politics. In Japan and South Korea, for example, the tariff on rice was a big deal, because the rice farmers are a very important interest group in those countries. So you have to kind of envision that by the time the early 2000s run around, the average tariff rate the United States charged on foreign countries was below 5%, who were signatories of this agreement. And most of our main trading partners, it was the same thing. It was, all of our main trading partners were members of this agreement. Plus, we had bilateral free trade agreements, which we continue to have with Canada and Mexico, with countries like Australia, many other countries in the Americas. We also have a free trade agreement with Israel, with Singapore, with Jordan. So there's a number of agreements. The European Union, which is a huge trading partner of the United States, we didn't have a separate trade agreement with them. So the tariffs that we charged each other were basically under this umbrella agreement, the World Trade Organization agreement. With the fall of the Soviet Union, then a lot of other countries entered the system.
Okay. Yep.
And then China formally enters the World Trade Organization in 2001. And of course, that was our trade with China was growing a lot even before then, but that really precipitated a very large expansion in our trade with China. And as a general rule, less developed countries, and China would still qualify as one, even though it has segments of its economy which are very modern, cutting edge, in fact.
Right.
And India would be another. And many other countries that don't even have the technological acumen of either of those countries typically have higher tariffs, even under the World Trade Organization agreement. So it's not symmetrical. The World Trade Organization tariffs are not negotiated that you charge me this, I charge you that. In that sense, it's not reciprocal. It's just they're negotiated, well, we'll bring your tariff on these items down to this. And they literally go item by item and negotiate it out. And, I had a student once who said that her dream was to become a trade lawyer. And I said, oh, God, why? Could you, you might be living in Geneva, in the shadows of the Alps or something, but you have to talk about the most boring things every day. You're going to be negotiating the tariff rate on, like, pencils. Is that really how you want to spend your life? Somebody's got to do it. But that's how these things are hammered out.
Did you talk her off that cliff?
I don't know what happened to her, but I haven't heard from her since.
No postcards from Geneva. The first big trade agreement I remember is NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And I remember the argument that then Congressman Bernie Sanders would make is that if we open, and he was against NAFTA, and he said, if you do this, then a lot of production is going to move to Mexico, where labor is paid significantly less. And as a big supporter of labor, you can understand what his concern was. But that's is that the logic that you understood on that?
Yeah, for sure. I was a graduate student during that time, so I was telling you earlier, I was at University of Illinois in the Corn Belt, right? And I remember my international trade professor went on public access TV to debate a local manufacturer of corn brooms. It's a very Illinois product, right? This is a classic labor-intensive manufactured good that this owner of this corn broom factory knew there was no way they were going to be able to compete with Mexican corn brooms once NAFTA was signed. And, he was right, for sure. There is going to be items, and this is indisputable. It's been so much research backing this up that, there's items that use relatively unskilled labor intensively. Manufacturing a corn broom would fall into that category. I'm not criticizing, but it doesn't require a great deal of training, to learn how to do that. So as a consequence, the United States, as it turns out, relative to a country like Mexico, we have relatively scarce unskilled labor. It may not seem like that to people, but when we take the ratio of skilled labor in the United States to the ratio of unskilled labor in the United States and compare that to the ratio of skilled labor to unskilled labor in the United States and compare that to the ratio of skilled labor to unskilled labor in Mexico, proportionally we have much more skilled labor. So the United States, in its trade with Mexico, would have comparative advantage in items that have relatively skill-intensive products, and we would import goods that have relatively unskilled intensive products. So that's without question that if you are an unskilled worker in the United States, the trade agreement was going to hurt you. No question in that regard, right? Because your real income will fall. That is what the theory says. That has been backed up in a lot of economic research. But if you're a relatively skilled worker, a free trade agreement with Mexico is actually going to help you. Your real income will rise. The opposite will occur in Mexico. Because if you're a skilled worker in Mexico, now you're facing all this competition from American skilled workers. So the skilled worker wage or real income in Mexico will fall, but the unskilled worker real income in Mexico will rise. So it's important to keep that in mind, that if you are arguing for protectionism to protect unskilled workers in the United States, well, then you're arguing to hurt unskilled workers in other countries.
Gotcha. Okay. So, and presumably what you want is the skilled workers. You want to expand the base of skilled workers in the United States and have them building products that maybe they wouldn't be able to do if they were unskilled workers making the corn brewers. Is that the theory?
Right. And and there's no sugarcoating it, right? I mean, the people who've done research on the Chinese, the expansion of American trade with China in the wake of their, adherence to the World Trade Organization, showed many, many industries where relatively unskilled workers got hammered by that. And no question that there was political fallout from that we're living with right now. On the other hand, a lot of people benefited from that trade, and we all got cheaper products,
right?
As a result, at least, the cheaper import products.
The most blatant example I can think of today is the manufacture of the iPhone, where you see these factories where people are, huge factory floors, thousands of people putting together components. In many cases, they're living in dormitories, and they're not paid an awful lot of money. And the argument is that $700 or $900 iPhone would cost $3,000 if it were produced in the United States of America. So, that's to me sort of the classic example where you and I as consumers are benefiting and could be really negatively affected if the kind of tariffs that are being talked about today by Trump are imposed.
No question. That would raise the price of a lot of consumer electronics. The thing is, it's also important to keep in mind with regards to a lot of goods like iPhones and more complicated goods like automobiles, that there are so many different parts in these items that come from different countries. They're a global product. And when you focus just where the final assembly takes place, you're missing out on a concept which is called value added, right? And a lot of the value added is not taking place in China for these items. So that means that they're importing items or in design and et cetera that people in other countries, including the United States, are earning money off of. So it's once you actually calculate trade by value added, it makes you realize that that things are not exactly as horrible as one would assume in terms of a trade deficit situation. For the most part, a trade deficit is not something to be concerned with. Particularly a bilateral trade deficit is not something that anyone should lose sleep over. Okay.
Why? Ultimately,
in the a trade deficit, right, is when your imports are greater than your exports. But there's an accounting identity in macroeconomics which basically says that that the trade deficit is just one or the trade balance, because it can be positive for some countries, is one component in something called the balance of payments, right? And the balance of payments adds together all of the flows of international transactions of a country, of which trade is only one. And the others are things that have to do with the movement of money across borders for investment purposes, for lending, and sometimes for things like, you may have heard of remittances. Right? A lot of people in the United States who have relatives overseas who send money to their relatives, that shows up in the balance of payments. It's not part of the trade deficit. When you add all those things up, it's called a balance of payments for a reason. They come to zero. And if you have a trade deficit, it means you have a surplus elsewhere. It is a sense that there's capital inflows to the United States that compensate for the trade deficit.
All right, let me see if I can oversimplify this. So it doesn't matter that we're importing a lot of iPhones from China and that they're being manufactured there, because we're not trying to sell the Chinese iPhones that are being manufactured here.
That's true. Yeah, I agree with that.
And there are many other products or other monetary instruments that it's hopefully going to zero out.
Correct. And the thing to keep in mind, that the flow of financial capital around the world is many, many times larger than the trade flows, right? And until at least recently, it's still the case that the United States as a destination for financial capital is without any equal in the world. I know it's hard for people to do the topsy-turvy financial markets of this year, but our historic role, for a long, long time has been one in which we're stable relatively economically. Our adherence to the rule of law historically meant that a lot of people were willing to park their money here as a safe haven. As a consequence, the dollar is a world currency of sorts. It's much more important than the nearest competitors even today. And the treasury bills that are emitted by our government, those are like the safest assets in the world, because the United States government has never defaulted on its debt in the entire history of the country. There's very few places that can say that.
Right.
And so if a lot of people want to park their money here, that means we are going to have a lot of capital inflows, which means we will have a trade deficit. So the one way we can paradoxically get rid of the trade deficits is if we become a much less attractive place to put your money. Well, then people will not be willing to park their money here, and now all of a sudden we'll have a trade surplus. But that's not the way. That would mean we're all poorer, not that we're all richer.
Right.
So sometimes be careful what you wish for. The trade deficit is, in some sense, not exclusively, but I'm just saying that one way to look at the trade deficit is it's actually indicator of our strength. It is also true that, yes, if we produced more goods that the rest of the world want at lower cost, this would improve without question. Without question that would help. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we should be worried about, particularly a bilateral trade deficit was one of many. We could have a trade deficit with one country, but have a trade surplus with another. And going back to the issue of comparative advantage, the United States has a very large trade surplus in the trade in services. If you focus exclusively on the trade in goods, we have a very large trade deficit, right? With But trade and services has been, which is very skill intensive, right? Typical services are very skill intensive: design services, advertising services, legal services, financial services, educational services. And this is an area of comparative advantage to the United States that has made a lot of people a great deal of money over the past decades.
When Donald Trump says we need to impose these high tariffs because other countries are ripping us off, what's your reaction as an economist when you hear that?
Well, I'm not even sure what he means by ripping us off. I mean, the thing that a transaction in trade is voluntary. No, this is an international trade transaction. In what scenario is someone forcing someone to import something? You know what I'm saying? If it's voluntary, that means that if someone chooses to bring some product into the country, they must have thought it was in their interest to do so. Now, would they have liked to have gotten the product cheaper? Surely, we all would like to get things cheaper, right? But if you agreed to pay a particular price for a particular good, then by that definition, it's like, well, it was voluntary. It's not like someone is holding you up for your insulin treatment, and making you, it's nothing like that. There's no equivalent to that for an iPhone. I think we could all be okay, if we didn't, you and I live without it for most of our lives. So we know that it's possible. And it would, so I don't believe in this idea of, it's a zero-sum way to think about trade, and I think about transactions and the exchange of goods and services as not a zero-sum, as a win-win. I gave you the money for this product because it was worth more to me than the money that I gave to you. If it was worth less to me than the money I gave to you, I would not have paid for it. But I voluntarily did that, and you sold it to me for that price. And you gave up the good for that price, so therefore the money was worth more to you than the good. Well, that means that we both gained from that exchange, right? And as long as trade is voluntary, so we don't live in a situation where things are being forced, or there is truly, literally charging people, thirsty in the desert for a glass of water situation. That is not. That doesn't make any sense to me to think like that. And again, getting ripped off. Okay, you could say, could we have gotten a better price on it? Could someone negotiating with someone else gotten a better price? I think that's the context that he's coming at the world from his real estate background, is that everything is boiling down to a negotiation, and that. But even then, if the transaction occurs, you say, yeah, maybe I could have gotten a price if I negotiated harder. Well, then why didn't you negotiate harder if it meant that much to you?
What do you think his motivation or thinking is when he says we're going to impose? Is it going back to what you said are the two motivations for tariffs, that it's either protecting American workers or raising revenue? Which of those two do you think, when he talks about imposing a 145% tariff on China, which of those two is he thinking about, or none of the, or is it C, none of the above?
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to read his mind because it's all over the place. Sometimes he'll refer to the revenue thing. Sometimes he'll refer to the protection thing. It's also the case that, there are real disputes with China about their economic policies. There are real disputes about them living up to their adherence agreement when they adhered. Those are real things. I don't want to say that other countries or the United States have their hands clean in terms of their policies. In that sense, you could say that there are policies that China is that he may be angling for. I know this was true in the first Trump administration and other administrations before that have been arguing about these things. There are policies in China that historically have made it difficult for American businesses and other foreign businesses in China to get in without partnering with a Chinese firm and perhaps giving away their trade secrets. There's been concern about that, right? And that's been one thing that people have been worried about. Another rule that people have been worried about is just that it's the line between kind of a private business and a public business in China is much murkier. Of course, it's becoming murkier here to some extent as well. But given that it is not anywhere near a free market country, right? Neither are we by that stretch of the imagination. But there's a lot of provincial government and national government involvement, and therefore the banking institutions and the financing of Chinese firms is all mixed up with a lot of public policy issues that people believe are like hidden subsidies of one thing or another, right? But it's very hard to negotiate with a country to say, we need you to change your entire political and economic system.
Are there products where it makes sense to impose tariffs?
I mean, the arguments for protection beyond revenue, there is a national security argument that most people would agree with, right? Much of the tariffs that have been imposed by the Trump administration have been using a clause in U.S. trade law that basically gives the president carte blanche to do whatever he or she wants in the event that there's an emergency, a national security style emergency. So there's little doubt that there are some products that you don't want to not produce because of national security reasons. Given that I'm not a defense specialist, I would hesitate to say what the list of those products are, right? But I'm sure that there's folks at the Pentagon who can say, we really have to maintain the ability to make this, that, and the other. And there could be that as well for example, public health reasons that we want. We learned in the pandemic some of the supply issues that we had with medicines and personal protective items that we say, hey, these are serious things that maybe we want to maintain some kind of capacity to do so in an emergency. So I don't think anyone is... In fact, you go back to Adam Smith. Adam Smith talked about that, in The Wealth of Nations, and spoke about reasons that you might want to impose tariffs.
Let's say there's a 30% tariff on all imports coming into the United States, and that this is where maybe this all settles out. Maybe it's 10%. In any case, whatever the number is the revenue that's going to be raised worth the cost to American workers, American consumers? How would you respond to that?
That's a great question. It's one that the theory talks about a lot. Now, again, like we said earlier, if you have an across-the-board 30% tariff on everything, it means you're really not doing it optimally in any way. Because the revenue maximum tariff is going to be different for each good because supply and demand conditions are different for each good. And the other thing, though, that you bring in, the optimal is different because, yes, every time you impose a tariff, the price is going to go up for the good. So you're going to hurt consumers. You're going to help some domestic producers. And you're going to get some tariff revenue as long as you don't eliminate all imports. So the question is, how do those three things balance out? Do the losses to consumers get outweighed by the gains to producers and the gains in tariff revenue? Well, it turns out that it's possible, the answer is yes, that the tariff will help tariff revenue and producers more than it hurts consumers, under the assumption that the world price of the product falls by enough. That it's connected to something called tariff rate pass-through. How much of a tariff, when it's imposed, gets passed on to consumers? If the answer is all of it, then it's definitely not going to ever be in the country's interest to do so in terms of the broad welfare effect. If it turns out that enough of the tariff gets absorbed by the foreign seller, then it is possible that the tariff generates additional revenue and benefits to domestic consumers that exceed any losses to consumers, because then the price didn't go up by that much. So the idea is that there's some sweet spot in there, and it's going to differ by good and by country. So for the example that we often use in the classes is that for a small country that is incapable of affecting the world price of a product with its trade policy, then it can only make itself worse off by imposing a tariff. However, they may still choose to do so because it's the least bad way that they can raise revenue. If you put yourself in many less developed countries, they don't even have the system and the political ability to impose an income tax like we do in the United States. They just simply can't. So tariff revenue is still their main source of revenue, and they know that, well, this isn't great for us, but it's the only way we can actually finance our government. The United States is not in that position, so it basically means that for a broad answer, would the tariff ever be in a country's interest, you have to say, well, then the price has to go down by enough. The one thing that you leave out of this is that you have to put yourself, well, then basically what I'm doing is I'm making myself better off as a country by making the other countries absorb most of the tariff, which means I'm making them worse off. Well, they're likely to retaliate. And if you doing something that may in isolation benefit you leads to them to retaliate, that retaliation could completely erase any benefit that you may have thought you were going to have. And that's the reality of what we face, is that every time the president has imposed an increase in the tariff, the other countries have responded, or at least said, we'll wait and see. But if you can count on it, even Mexico, which has been very reluctant because Mexico still has a lot to lose from a trade war with the United States. But if the Trump administration basically puts it in a situation where he says, well, he's really not going to remove these, well, then they will hit back because they basically have to politically for their own reasons.
All right, let's stick with the Mexico example. Let's say that the United States imposes a 30% tariff on Mexico. They respond with a 30% tariff. What's the consequence, the negative consequence to the United States or the negative consequence to Mexico on that?
Well, what we spoke about earlier, we're exactly going in reverse. So in both countries, total income, the economies shrink, and there's a reallocation of income within this. So the pies get smaller in both countries, and the pie is redistributed within both countries. In the United States, the pie gets redistributed towards unskilled labor and away from skilled labor. In Mexico, the pie gets distributed away from unskilled labor and towards skilled labor. So basically, you're taking the poorer people in Mexico and you're making them worse off. Well, then you better have a very tight border because you don't basically throw your neighboring country with 90, 100, I don't even know what is 100 million people into a tailspin. That is that's not necessarily something that you would want to do as a good neighbor.
What about Canada? What if we had a reciprocal 30% tariff in each of those countries? What would be the negative consequences?
Canada is also a country that's very vulnerable to the United States. A lot of their exports go to the United States. They're not as vulnerable as Mexico, and they're starting from a much higher relative income. And And the trade theory that I spoke about that explains our trade with Mexico so well doesn't do such a great job explaining our trade with Canada, because the profile of skilled to unskilled labor in Canada and the United States is actually quite similar. So there are other trade theories that explain the pattern of trade between countries with relatively similar distributions of factors of production. But yeah, you could count on the fact that that Canada would be hit hard. Canada and the United States, since the 1960s, have had basically something called the Auto Pact was set in, even way before NAFTA, which allowed free trade in automobiles. And so Michigan and Ontario became extremely tightly connected, right? And so the unions in the two countries are connected. So there's a great deal of integration that we would be basically causing havoc to, that has built up over 50 years.
What would a 30% reciprocal tariff impose us on China and China on us?
Well, the odd thing is that one is likely to have less of an impact than because remember what I said earlier, our trade with Canada and Mexico is almost free. So you go from almost free to 30%, that's going to have a monstrous impact, right? But if you're starting at 20% and go to 30%, which is where we end, the first set of Trump tariffs during the first Trump administration brought us up in the 18 to 20% range there, if I'm not mistaken. And the Biden administration didn't take those off. They kept them on against China for reasons that I spoke about earlier. So what happens? If you're going from 20 to, it still is a 50% increase from 20 to 30, right? But it isn't likely, unless you have particular elasticities involved, to have as significant an impact in that regard. In fact, there's many goods for which you'd say, another 10% tax. I'm not going to love it, but 10 percentage points more. I mean, you can ask yourself, your iPhone, what is it, $800? It goes up to $880 now. Do I stop? Well, they're not going to lose 75% of their business. That's not likely. But if it went, you increase by 30 percentage points, or double it, go from $800 to $1,600. Well, yes, you're going to lose a lot of business.
Would any of that production, do you think, come back to the United States?
Well, it depends on what our tariffs are with other countries. Because what happened in the first Trump administration, when we had the increase in tariffs with China, that a lot of Chinese companies then offshore their production to places like Vietnam, right? So if we, wait, the only way you actually is, there are many, many other countries that have cheaper unskilled labor than the United States, and again, in terms of well-paying jobs, those jobs, because it's already an international product, our inputs and our production of our high-skilled workers are already seen in those products. So if you focus too much on the assembly, do I care where the final thing gets set up? Do I just want the most high-value portions of the product to be made in the places like the United States, where we have a lot of skilled engineers and developers and advertising personnel and things of that nature? So, no, in all likelihood, the only way we prevent that from being just moved to some other country is by imposing high tariffs everywhere. And do you really want to beat up on Bangladesh? Do you really want to beat up on some of the poorest countries in the world? It just seems like that hasn't been, of course, we just shut down AID, but we may not have always been the most generous country in the world, but it's one thing to just flip it and say we're actually going to take a baseball bat to your economy.
That wraps it up for this edition of 802 News, sponsored by Red Hen Baking Company. Thanks for listening.